I think it's a transition to a hyper-Bitcoinized world, but we've got structures in place that we don't want to see destroyed in the transition there. And so to your point, one of the big things that I look at, and this is where, rightly or wrongly, I'm thrilled to see Russia get an understanding of what Bitcoin is, and the Qataris and Saudis understand what Bitcoin is and get into Bitcoin mining. My understanding of the world is, we've got these huge oil nations basically producing oil and exporting. They denominate, most of their global trade is denominated in USD, and there's circa $10 billion of trade globally on our oil markets. What happens when these producers start saying, hey, I only want to accept Bitcoin for this? Now, that makes perfect sense. You're exchanging energy for energy, fundamentally. Whereas at the moment, they're exchanging energy in the form of barrels of oil for something that just gets printed, that's worth nothing. So to me, I look at this and think we're going to have, this is in a broader context sort of point that's really important to make, is that there are probably two major sources of demand coming for Bitcoin. One is the switch from a petrodollar to a Bitcoin-based commodity system, whereby every producer of commodity is going to want to and enforce the payment in Bitcoin, because they know that is the scarcest asset that they can get for that barrel of oil, that ounce of gold, whatever they might be selling. That is the thing that they're going to want. And then you look at that, and just the oil market is a $10 billion a day market. Now, the Bitcoin community was frothing over the ETFs bringing maybe, $1 billion or $2 billion of demand to the Bitcoin market on a daily basis. What happens when there is 24/7, 365 demand of $10 billion a day from the oil markets for Bitcoin? What happens to the price then? The other component to this is, and the other major driver of demand is going to be from the bond market. When the 300 trillion in worthless or negative real yield bonds figure out, hang on a second, we need to have a convertible note, we need to partake in what MicroStrategy is doing, and we want to get a real return, so we're going to buy those bonds that are backed by Bitcoin. Now, that's going to convert and create a whole host of demand. And I look at this and think, we could have 10% of the bond issuance on a yearly basis go into Bitcoin, and that would be literally $7 trillion a year going into Bitcoin as demand. When you couple that with $10 billion a day in oil, that's going to be, circa another $3 trillion. Like right there, we've got $10 trillion worth of global demand on a yearly basis just for Bitcoin. I look at that and think, this is where we, enter the twilight zone. Nothing makes sense anymore when that happens. And from an oil producing nation perspective, I look at in the, say, geopolitical sense, why would they want to do that? And that's what probably most people are looking at, thinking, well, why would they actually do that? Why would they take payment for Bitcoin rather than dollars? It's like, because they want to be independent. If they take or sell their commodities for Bitcoin, they are completely independent. And I look at what happened in the geopolitical context with the Ukraine-Russia war and Nord Stream 2 pipeline being blown up. Russia spent billions and billions of dollars creating a gas pipeline from Russia down to Europe to supply them with gas. It took years and years of expense, and it took years and years of man-hour, billions of dollars to do that, so that they could sell billions of dollars of gas to them on an annual basis. They had to ship that gas down to Europe to buy because they didn't have an internal market to monetize it. What happens when Bitcoin's trading at millions or tens or hundreds of millions of dollars per Bitcoin? All of a sudden, they don't have to ship any oil or any gas offshore. They can just buy Bitcoin miners and monetize it by basically becoming Bitcoin miners. Now, all of a sudden, that lowers the temperature from a geopolitical perspective, because nation states can now harness and monetize their stranded resources. So all of a sudden, I look at this and think Bitcoin has a way, not only from a number of different ways, to really lower the temperature from a war perspective, because not only is there no monetary benefit in doing that anymore, it also de-escalates conflicts, because Russia can basically keep all of their gas consumption internally by effectively mining Bitcoin. And I look at this and think, once the price of Bitcoin goes up enough, they're going to do that. And then Europe's going to have a problem, because why would you risk, capital, time, energy, money in building out these pipelines that can be blown up by a a rogue team of scuba divers when you don't have to face any risk by just mining it on your sovereign territory. Yeah, I just look at this and think we have so much to look forward to once the world understands this. And this is to that reverse triangle of capital that we need to get to. As Bitcoin grows up that stack and gets bigger and bigger, then these opportunities present itself, and I think it leads to a much better world.
Yeah, and you kind of just touched on, or not kind of, you did touch on really the other part of the demonetizing war aspect. So we talked about kind of the wrench attack earlier. People, you get beat over your head, your gold's taken or whatever, you burn your house down, all your assets are gone. Well, there's, you touched on this other part, and we're not going to get into it today, but just like you said, the pressure of the room and the temperature goes down, literally and figuratively, cleaning up the environment, what Bitcoin's doing there, which we had not even getting into that today, but it's just, when the world sees what's going on within the Bitcoin network, it's going to just blow people's minds. It's going to blow them. So what do you think with yields spiking? What do you think is going to happen here with Trump? Obviously, he's very linked to the stock market, and I'd love for you to kind of unpack this a little bit. What your thoughts are? Are they going to come in and kind of really get the puppy humming here and be on Jerome Powell to drop rates, and because we know he looks at the stock market every day, and now apparently he's looking at the Bitcoin price every day. So Trump's going to have those two tickers sitting there and watching those as gauges as to what's going on. What's your prognostication here?
It's a very good question. It comes in many layers. I look at this and think he is looking at all of this. Depending on what he is trying to optimize for is going to be the result of what we get. So you've got, I guess, that 10 years really spiking, and all of a sudden we're coming out of an inverted yield curve, which has been for years. There is that premise of, well, maybe inflation is coming back and the genie is out of the bottle. If you look at historical records and overlay, say, what's happened in the last 4 years with what happened in the 70s, then it's tracking really well to have a huge increase in inflation, and that's going to not bode well for a drop in interest rates. The key metric is going to be does this Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, is that going to produce the outcomes that's going to help lower inflation, drive economic growth, and then relieve pressure on the interest rates and take pressure off there? I don't think, actually, it's really hard to bet against Elon because he just proves everyone wrong. But I look at this and think it's hard to bet against Elon and Trump in this, in that they work in very different ways. They have key outcomes and drivers that they're trying to achieve, and a lot of the time, I think the messaging that they deliver is misunderstood, and a lot of people who know less than them will say, "Oh, there's no way that will work. That's not going to work. That's going to lead to X, Y, and Z." And then fast forward, Elon Musk is catching spaceships with chopsticks and doing stuff that no one could have dreamed of. So I think betting against those two is going to be very difficult. So I like to think that they can craft outcomes that we can't see or understand yet, because if you look at it from a traditional view, you'd think that this spiking interest rate on the 10-year is going to lead to and further compound the inflation problems that we're going to see, and then that's going to make the DOGE efforts all the more harder, because at the same time that they're cutting jobs and trying to create economic growth and room for economic growth, they're going to have inflation spiking, rates spiking, and it's going to be a bad outcome. But this is where I look at Bitcoin as a solution, because it's probably the most egalitarian investment that I've seen. It's accessible to anyone with a smartphone. And I look at, in the US, what is it, a population of circa 350 million, approaching 400 million people. And I would have thought there'd be over 300 million smartphones there, probably closer to 350. About 90% penetration, I would have thought, in the US. And anyone with a smartphone, can purchase Bitcoin now. And I look at this and think, will Trump want to endorse and help facilitate that outcome? If I look at his administration team that's coming in and think Howard Lutnick, heavily in the bag for Bitcoin, RFK Jr., one of his largest investments is Bitcoin. Vivek Ramaswamy has had his Strive Asset Management change his investment thesis with the SEC to allow for investment in Bitcoin ETF. Everyone in that administration is in the bag for Bitcoin. So I look at this and think there represents a rare opportunity in US culture to embrace Bitcoin and endorse it, much the same way that they endorsed home ownership in the late 90s. Obviously, the late 90s endorsement of home ownership to open that up to anyone who wanted a home ultimately led to a problem with the GFC later. Those policies that they crafted in the late 90s, which I think was overseen by Bill Clinton, they could do the same thing with Bitcoin and draft policies, create government incentives and outcomes to drive Bitcoin adoption. And then to one of the points we raised earlier, that $1 trillion into Bitcoin is going to create $50 trillion in equity or collateral. I look at that and think, well, what if that's the plan? And we've heard Trump allude even facetiously to the fact that he could pay off the US debt with a little Bitcoin. So if that's the case, one Bitcoin could pay off the US national debt. That's currently trailing at about $36 trillion. So maybe my method for calculating Bitcoin is a lot closer to the mark if Trump thinks it's 36 trillion a coin.
If you like that clip, then you definitely got to check out this next spicy clip. I think you're really going to like it. Come on, check it out. But if you want the full version, the full interview, then check that out over here. Come on, do it. See you in there.